All right. So in this case, 1971, there's a new Chief Justice on the court, Chief Justice Berger, nominated by President Nixon. So we have a conservative leading the Supreme Court at this time. It's important to note that this case, 1971, is the last case that deals with school desegregation slash integration, which is unanimous. This is the last unanimous case. Every case from this point on had dissenters and had disagreement. Um, but this case remains unanimous, and this case still remains an activist decision by the court. So even though it was being led by a conservative, it's still a very liberal decision, liberal policy, and still very activist. So in this case, the Supreme Court is simply reviewing the actions of the Charlotte School Board. And the reason why they're reviewing his actions um, is because despite steps that had been taken on behalf of the school board, um, over 2/3 of African American children still went to schools that were 99% African American. And so segregation still existed, even though, according to the school board, vestiges of segregation was removed. So the Supreme Court was reviewing this action. Uh, the federal district court judge uh, in this case gets empowered. Remember that under Brown 2, federal district court judges were empowered to review these school systems to make sure that they met with meeting Brown 1 and Brown 2. And so the Supreme Court in this case empowers the federal district judges to basically impose integration. And they do so. They say that you can do so looking in sort of three sort of ways. And the Supreme Court kind of gives some guidelines to the federal district court judges in terms of what they should be looking for. First and most simply is the federal district court judge should look to the Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education and urge them to alter school district zones. Like if your school districts are drawn in a fashion that neatly segregates people, then even though white or African American students could go to any school, you've drawn school districts in such a fashion as to segregate anyways. So if you redraw school districts, that might be one means tested or one way in which to get to integration. Another way, and the Supreme Court says, is you can start with quotas. That if your goal is integration, if your goal is to integrate these groups of people within the educational system, then quotas aren't a bad starting point. They're not an end. And even the court in its most liberal here doesn't say that quotas are the end and they aren't the only thing that they use, but they're a tool that you can use within this arsenal. And lastly, the Supreme Court says that busing is a tool of educational policy, and it's another tool that these district court judges should use. And so the Supreme Court says that these district court judges should have the power to order busing to counter the effects of clustered residences. And that's simply, as we mentioned before, like people living together, where whites flee to the suburbs and African Americans remain within the city. And so the court says that busing is one way to sort of solve this. But you can see that all of these policy recommendations that the court is making, whether it's school districts, quotas, or busing, none of that is desegregation. All of it is towards a very specific policy end, and that policy end is integrating, making sure the school districts are integrated. That's very different from the language of desegregation. The Supreme Court didn't say that only African American students would bust, but they also argued that everyone would be bust. And the Supreme Court says that they wanted a reasonable, feasible, and workable plan, and one that works right now. Remember, this is years after, almost 20 years after Brown 2. All deliberate speed has to be met. All deliberate speed, all deliberate speed is not 20 years. And the court is simply fed up with school boards and states, and to some extent, the local district judges, federal district judges who were overseeing this, in terms of dragging their feet. Um, the court says that almost anything that will work to integrate these school systems is acceptable. And district judges are very, very, very empowered to make sure these plans are enforced, not just in place, but actually enforce these plans. And so you can see that the court has moved away, even in 3 years, to you have to make sure you integrate, to here are 3 ways in which you could start to integrate. And federal district judge, you make sure that they do these things to get to the goal of integration. And so this is exceedingly activist, but it gets towards a policy end that local elected officials were attempting to skirt around. As a side note, in the year 2000, the district court judge overseeing the Charlotte school system ruled that desegregation finally had been achieved, and thus busing and other counting orders in this case would no longer apply. So it took 30 years from the issuance of this case for the local district judge to say that, okay, you have finally complied with Brown 1 and Brown 2. We're talking 1954 to the year 2000 to comply with a court order. I don't need to tell you that if it took you, any one individual, that long to comply with a court order, you would simply be arrested. And it should note that there are still some covered districts that are under review by local district judges to make sure that they comply with Brown 1 and Brown 2. Simply stating that fact should sound absurd, but that's where we are. This is a very heavy-handed approach, but you have to understand that the heavy-handedness of this approach is exactly because there was significant resistance. In this case in particular, the compliance didn't exist for 30 years after the decision of the court. But it turns out that, remember, the court was emboldened by having support of the president and of Congress. Well, president and Congress were still supportive of desegregation efforts. However, busing was unpopular as a policy end. And it wasn't just unpopular in the southern in the southern districts that were sort of resisting these orders. It was largely unpopular nationwide. And so there was a great deal of opposition to these Supreme Court ordered busings. And we begin to see that some of the judges on the court sort of begin to mirror society and begin to push back against this as a court-ordered remedy.